And you got to lay over in Miami, then you fly over and you get there at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And Span said it's a long 5-hour ride to Ica from here, and so make sure you take advantage of the buffet and fill up because we won't be stopping for lunch. So he gave me the slot where everybody came in the middle of the night and then ate a big breakfast and then sat down in the worship service in there. And I was to keep them awake during preaching then. Nobody fell asleep. So my task is to keep you guys awake, keep myself awake as well. So I've got the perfect after meal lesson. At St. Augustine Road, we do just a little 10-minute devotional after our church eat church. But Randy said, "Oh, you're doing a full-blown lesson there." And I had one, but told you about technical difficulties I had there. So we're going to look at some meals in the Bible. And when I think about family meals, if you're a door-to-door salesman or you go into somebody's house and you're going to sell them insurance or whatever it is, a home appliance or a vacuum cleaner or something, you don't want to sit down in the living room and have everybody get on the couch and in their easy chair and relax. You want to get those folks to the kitchen table because that's where all the decisions are made, at the kitchen table. That's where families talk things over. And I like to watch Blue Bloods. I think it's a very good show, very interesting show. Characters are very believable in that show, which I like. I can't watch a show that I can't get behind the characters and follow the characters. But it always ends near about at the end of the show where they're at the Sunday supper table, that they all gather together as a family, and it's like a cardinal sin, using a Catholic term there because they're Catholic, to miss the family Sunday meal, and that's kind of where everything's hashed out, the problems, the fun, everything that happens at the kitchen table. And that's missing in our society today, that kitchen table. In our house, you were there for supper. We ate as a family. That never changed. And centered around meals mostly before we came to worship service or Wednesday night Bible class. Wednesday nights, I used to bring pizza home. And my kids would be out playing in the neighborhood. Yeah, kids did that 25 years ago. Still, they played in the neighborhood. And when they saw that red truck coming home, had a different garnet-colored truck then, Randy, they knew Daddy had pizza. They see that truck turn into Francis Lake, and they'd all run home because we're going to have pizza, and then, of course, we're going to Bible study. And then Sunday morning is pancake. Daddy's going to fix pancakes. Everybody loves pancakes. They get up for pancakes and be off to Bible. So I never had any problem getting my children to go to worship service or Bible study because of meals. And it was a privilege to sit at the king's table. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David's table, the king. And he fell on his face and he did reverence. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And David said unto him, "Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and I will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually." 2 Samuel 9, verses 6 and 7. What a privilege to sit at the king's table. And of course, this young man was worried for his life because he was the last of Saul's family, Jonathan's son, who was friends with David. And of course, David had mercy on him. And when we think about meals in the Bible, we could talk about the feeding of the 5,000. We have lessons on those from the Sermon on the Mount. The Lord's Supper, which Randy did a good job letting us know. Yes, that's so important each and every week to remember the Lord's death is sacrificed for us so that we can get through our week living for him. We die to ourselves along the way, keeping that in mind. And, of course, the Passover, so important for the children of Israel leaving Egypt there and what that meant to them long and along. And Christ absorbed the Passover meals. We could talk about them. And then the wedding feast in Luke chapter 14 where Christ is sitting at the table of the religious leaders of the day there, and as he's sitting there at supper, they began to speak, and those tables were set up kind of in a court with roads passing by, and the crowds would gather around there, and they would sit there and listen to Jesus. And not only did he tell the parable of the wedding feast there, but he told many other parables there. And sometimes he talked to the people sitting at the table with him, and other times he was addressing the crowds that were gathered around there. So you begin reading in there, and you see parable after parable after parable in there, what Jesus spoke there. And then, of course, we could talk about manna from heaven that was given daily to the children of Israel. And what nutritious stuff that must have been for them to eat that manna and never get sick. And all those years just eating that light bread, they called it. Oh, they got to loathe it there. And in John chapter 20, we talked about last week when we talked about Thomas, how Christ cooked some fresh fish right there on the beach. You know, he had a couple of fish going for him, and he cooked for the apostles. There's 7 of them that were there that day. But the meal that I want to talk to you about comes from Acts chapter 20. We'll get some lessons out of this. Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12 there. I call it an eventful Sunday at Troas. Acts chapter 20. Troas was a seaport city. It was founded about 300 BC by Antigonus, a successor of Alexander the Great. It was about 10 miles south of the city of Troy in Asia Minor. It was made a Roman colony by the Emperor Augustus in 31 BC. He reigned to about 14 AD. Troas was visited several times by Paul during his missionary journeys. We can see in Acts 16 on his second journey where he was joined by Luke. On his third journey, having left Ephesus, which he mentioned in 2 Corinthians 2 as well as Acts 20. And again on his third journey, having left Philippi, Acts 20 and verse 6. And if you remember, in 2 Timothy 4:13, Paul asked Timothy to bring the cloak that I left at Troas. So that's the city that we're talking about there. And of course, he tells him to bring the books and the parchments as well, so that those can be read and studied from. So here we are, on Paul's third visit here. Luke describes this eventful Sunday for the church here. So we're first told about the assembly there of the disciples on the first day of the week. And so here it refers to Sunday, the first day of the week. And this was the dawn of the day that Jesus arose from the grave in Matthew 20, verse 1. It's the day of the week that the church began, that we can read about in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 47 or so there. It's the day of the week where we are to lay by and store 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, which we accomplished earlier in the assembly. And it's the day which began to be known as the Lord's Day, Revelation 1, verse 10. So one lesson that we learn here is that they came together to break bread. This was the reason that they were assembled on the first day of the week, to absorb the Lord's Supper, which the Lord instituted in Luke chapter 22, and that they continued in Acts 2:42, the apostle teaching and fellowship and breaking of bread there. And on the first day of the week here in verse 7, we learn about that it's a communion in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and we learn that we need to observe it with the right mindset, in the right order, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which we often refer to when we're discussing taking of the Lord's Supper. So here they are, taking this weekly practice that the early church took part in, assembled on the day of the week, precisely as the early Christians, to observe this memorial feast instituted by Jesus himself. The disciples in Troas, they had a special guest speaker that day. The apostle Paul came to preach here, along with 8 other guests, most of whose names I can't pronounce, but I will tell you that Timothy and Gaius were there because I can pronounce their names. If you want to go in there and read the names of the people that are there, you can read them there in verses 4 through 6. But I'm not going to attempt those names there. And an apostle of Jesus Christ as a guest speaker we just had Cliff Goodwin here not too long ago. Can you imagine if we had somebody of the stature of the Apostle Paul coming to speak to us? They must have made much preparation for this, and we're looking forward to this here. And Paul had established and strengthened churches throughout the region there. So let's look at the sermon that he brought there. We're not told what the subject matter was, but we know that it was a long one. That they didn't cut him off at 20 minutes. You know, nobody in the back row going, all right, cut it off there, Paul. Paul had a lot to say, and there's a lot of things that he could have preached about. There on a subject matter could have been the gospel of Jesus Christ, which Paul was not ashamed of. He tells us about in Romans 1:14 through 17. He's always ready to preach the gospel. And we were talking about how my electronics had messed up on me this morning. I was talking to Michael. I said, well, everybody's got to have your I'm ready right now sermon. So as preachers, we need to have that hip pocket sermon that we can preach. And of course, the Apostle Paul was inspired. He could have talked about living by faith. He could have been exhortations to live a holy, sanctified life. First Thessalonians 4:1 through 3 would be a nice sermon outline there, living apart from the world, not being entangled there in it. And he could have talked about tribulation and trouble and persecution, which was all going on at that particular time, through what we must much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God, Acts 14:21 through 22. But whatever the subject was, it was a long sermon. I once asked the church in Jasper, I said, well, I'm kind of out of ideas. And if I got any ideas what you want me to preach next week? Lady on the front row said, a short one. So preach a short one. Might have been this one because it's not very long, I promise you. But he continued his message until midnight. Verse 7 tells us there. He later picked up again in verse 11, and he preached until daybreak. So preaching until midnight wasn't enough for the Apostle Paul. He had a lot to say. Remember, this is the early church, and they needed to take advantage while Paul was there. And he was a hard worker, so he preached all night and until daybreak because he was partying the next day. So they took advantage of his picking his brain while he was there. But what a privilege to sit and listen and learn from the Apostle Paul. And for those willing to stay all night, they got a special treat, if you will. What they might have first looked at as a tragedy turned into a triumph, because we see there was a sleepy young man there, and his name was Eutychus, and he was up in the upper room, we see in verse 8 there, sitting in a window, and he was sinking into a deep sleep. Now I see some eyes closing in here too, so must have had a meal or something like we just had there. So he's sitting there in the window, and he's overcome by sleep. And in this crowded room, maybe the heat there, maybe the lamps were dimming in there. Maybe all this contributed to his drowsiness. But he was a lucky young man. The name Eutychus literally means fortunate or good luck. That's what his name meant. So he's overcome by sleep, and he fell from the third story, and he died. Verse 9 tells us. And then Paul went down, fell on him, and embraced him. Verse 10 tells us. Kind of reminds us of another meal in the Old Testament, Elijah. God told him to go hide by the brook of Cherith in 1 Kings 17:4. And the Bible there says that is before Jordan, and to drink of the brook, God commanded the ravens to feed thee there. After that, he went to Zarephath in Zidon and dwelt there with a widow woman who fed him many meals. When her son fell sick and died, Elijah stretched himself upon the child 3 times, and he revived. 1 Kings 17, verse 21. So Paul stretches himself over this young man, and he revived. So Elijah also stretched upon the dead child, and afterwards, he goes to Gilgal, where a pottage was made, another meal there for the prophets, from some gourds and a wild vine that poisoned the pot. And they didn't know Elijah as a prophet until he added some meal and made it edible and saved the prophets there from being poisoned there. There was 100 men were fed from 20 loaves and ears of corn with some left. Verse 44 in 2 Kings 4. So not only did Christ multiply food was multiplied there as well on that meal in the Old Testament. But going back to our story in Acts chapter 20, Paul then said, "Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him." Acts 20, verse 10. Reminds us of Jesus talking in Mark chapter 5, verse 39. Jesus said, "Why weep? The damsel is not dead." So we see some parallels in Paul raising the dead and Jesus raising the dead as well. It says there that Paul then broke bread and ate and talked until daybreak and departed. Acts 20, verse 11. So the question is, was this the Lord's Supper? It's the same language in verse 7. They broke bread. Or was it a common meal to refresh Paul before the journey? Well, let's think about it. If Luke used Roman time, as many presume, it would have now been Monday, not Sunday, not the first day of the week, which was alluded to in verse 7. So here the compound broke bread and ate signifies an ordinary meal, not the Lord's Supper. And the second reference to breaking bread seems to take that phrase beyond the Lord's Supper and describes what could well be called a midnight snack. They had a little midnight snack there. So with the young man brought alive, the English Standard Version said they were not a little comforted. What an understatement. Somebody fell and died and was brought back to life. They should have been a lot comforted there that they got to witness this miracle by the Apostle Paul, whom they had been listening to for this long time, preaching there. Should say they were greatly comforted in that there. So to draw some conclusions, and the lesson will be yours, truly an eventful day there in Troas for those disciples that were able to listen to the Apostle Paul and witness this miracle here. To absorb the Lord's Supper is an example that we have here on the first day of the week. That's when we do that. That's every Sunday. And to hear our beloved Apostle Paul share the wisdom given to him, 2 Peter 3:15, about the wisdom also in Paul's writing that Peter talks about, giving recommendation to reading the Apostle Paul's letters as well. And the witness to raising of young Eutychus from the dead, to enjoy a midnight meal with Paul and talk until daybreak until he departed the next day. So what day the church assembled for worship and for what reason? We find in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. Confirmation of Paul as a true disciple of Christ by the miracle that he performed that night. He often had to defend his credentials as an apostle, because many said that he wasn't, and he had to defend that there, but this certainly confirmed that there. 2 Corinthians 12 says, "Truly the signs of an apostle were wrought among you all in signs and wonders and mighty deeds." Paul defending himself there. One commentator put it this way: attend church regularly, especially on Sunday, and try not to fall asleep. So everybody stayed awake through that. So hopefully those lessons of several meals we talked about in the Bible, especially that one in Acts chapter 20, we get the commandment to assemble, take the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. And as Randy said, it's the most important thing you'll do all week long. It'll keep you going. Remind you of the Lord and what he did for you, and that's why we do it on every first day of the week. And this afternoon, if you've got a need that the church can help you with by prayer, certainly we we stand ready to receive you down front. And we pray that you'll have a blessed week, be fruitful, not only in leadership of your family, but in the occupation that you'll go to work at Monday morning. Those of us that aren't retired, get things done and be blessed and share the gospel. If we can help you in any way, please join in the invitation song.